Hi, welcome to Herd Nerds. We have a great podcast today. My guest, I can actually say, was hired by the Japanese to teach them how to feed their cattle. I want to welcome Dr. Jimmy Horner. Hi, Dr. Horner.
Good morning, Desi. Great to see you.
Would you please, for people that don't know you, would you please tell a bit about yourself?
Sure, be glad to. Hope I don't bore them too much, but I I'm a ruminant nutritionist and been doing that for 38 years. This coming January 1, and uh, love what I do. I get to work with wonderful people and people that know me typically will vouch for the fact that I claim to be the most blessed man on the face of the earth because I get to do what I love. I get to work with people that I love, and I have the most amazing family and friends that anybody could have. So I consider myself an extremely blessed man. But I started my career about 38 years ago. I actually started working with Wagyu cattle. It will be 30 years this coming April when I was first invited to travel to Japan, and it's been quite a journey. It's been an awesome journey. Have learned so much, and continue to learn. I think that's very important for any of us. We can never stop learning. We can never stop the desire to learn. And a lot of folks gave me the opportunity. Have believed in me, and I'll forever be indebted to them. But if you want me to share initially, when I was first invited to go to Japan back in April of '94, it was actually to do dairy seminars. A good friend of mine, Tom Van Vliet, Escalon, California, his family had a large surge dairy equipment supply business and had been doing business in Japan and other places, obviously. And through his contact, they had asked me to come over and conduct seminars throughout the country. And so that for the first several visits, that's what we did. And large gatherings, typically 100, 200, 300 folks in attendance, dairy producers, Wagyu producers, and we'll talk about that more here a little bit, I'm sure. Many times those are one and the same, as most dairies over there also own Wagyu cattle. And veterinarians, co-op personnel, and we did that for a number of years. And that's how I began my journey in Japan. But folks that know me, the seminars are great, but I love being on the farm and I love being with the people and the cattle. And so I asked if we could start visiting some of the farms, and that's what we did. And then that's how I ended up getting into the Wagyu end of things, because many of the dairymen also owned Wagyu cattle, and started asking me to help them with their Wagyu cattle. So that's kind of how my journey began over this past 30 years.
And I think our listeners want to know. I'd like for you to tell them how different it is raising the Wagyu in Japan than what most people do over here, and the requirements that the cattle need here in order to get their genetics expressed to the best level. You've done a lot of research in that and studying that and nutrition research, and I just can't wait for you to tell everybody about it.
Yes, ma'am. Be glad to. The first thing that we have to acknowledge is we have a totally different production system as a whole here in the U.S. For our cattle, our Wagyu cattle specifically, than how the Japanese manage them. They primarily, majority of their Wagyu cattle are not bred. They're implanted with embryos. Many of the first calf heifers may actually be inseminated with Wagyu semen and produce F1 calves, as they're much more valuable than, say, a Holstein calf there. And the same here also. We do have more dairies here doing the same thing along those lines now. But so the dam never really gets to express much maternal instinct, also because they typically remove the calves from mom by day 3. The overwhelming majority of the calves in Japan are bottle fed by hand, or
Yes.
they're on an automatic milk feeder or an automatic nurse cow, you want to call them, where the calf can go up 4, 6, 8, 10 times per day and nurse from a machine. But very few of the Wagyu producers will leave the calves on the cow longer than 3 days. They'll allow them to get their colostrum. Many of them will take them off day one and actually feed them a colostrum replacer. Um,
Mm.
and so they're virtually never on mom. So we have taken that same uh, breed and put it in a totally different production system here in the States. Of all the folks we work with here in the United States and North America, I can count on one hand those producers that actually bottle feed or have their calves bottle fed at a local dairy or something, their Wagyu calves. So it's a totally different production system, and it presents a lot of challenges nutritionally and management wise to get the most out of those cows and those calves.
Yeah, I know, and I'd like to make this comment that that is one of the reasons why the black Wagyu females usually don't have very big bags, and that's because the genetically it's been bred out of them because they never raise their calves. Do you agree with that, Dr. Horner?
That large part, Daisy, that is absolutely correct. And we've taken that same female over here and many other places outside Japan and tend to leave that calf on that female for 4, 6, 8 months, maybe on a 20,000 acre pasture, and expect them to do well. And that's not what they're designed for. And we can produce them under that system. We have to make some adjustments, management wise and nutritionally, to help that calf because of the inherent nature of that cow and her lack of milk production, her lack of maternal instinct, and it's not her fault. It's just a production system that breed has come from in Japan, where that female is primarily a uterus in Japan, whereas here we expect her to do everything, and so we have to help her, and that's where the difference comes in. When they're in our production system over here, I always say this, that if you have a calf on a Wagyu female, creep feeding is not an option. That calf has to be creep fed. In fact, the cow will probably even need to be trained as well while that calf is on her, just to help her milk production, uh, because of the genetic predisposition, due to how she's handled and managed in Japan. If we do that, uh, we can help the calf quite a bit. But we also, not only that, feeding them a high protein, a high energy creep feed is important. Keeping the mama fed where she can produce as much milk as possible, and then also minimizing the stress in both of them while that calf is on that cow is of critical importance. That's another big difference in how we typically manage Wagyu cattle here in the States versus Japan, because many of them in Japan will never be outside an enclosed facility or barn. Again, where here they may be on a very large ranch, and sometimes with almost no shelter, no facilities. So we have two drastically different production systems with the same breed, and we can do well, but we have to help them along and do some things differently than what maybe our mindset has led us to through the years.
One thing I did for my small herd, and I don't know this may not even be right, but I bought a couple of milk cows and bred them, and then when they had their babies, it was like two or three Wagyu babies were also nursing off those milk cows, in order to get enough milk. And for those people doing percentage animals, a lot of their cows are going to have nice big bags, and in the first few days they're going to have plenty of milk. And actually, one of the things I've noticed about Wagyu calves is they are gone to whoever has a bag. I mean, they know who their mama is, but they don't hold back about going and getting some milk. Have you noticed that? I mean, is it just
Yeah,
me, or I just they're unbelievably they're headed out for that milk bag?
yeah, they've got that nature, and you can't blame them. They're looking for
No.
food, and they're going to do whatever they can to find it. Um, which is key. And Desi, I want to say too, though, with that is a limitation in our Wagyu breed. It continues to be a limitation. I'm not a geneticist, I'm a nutritionist, but I always stress to our clients that they emphasize milk yield potential through their breeding programs to help. And we do have herds here in North America that are making great strides in the cow's milk production. First calf heifers, and you can see it. You can see it in the calves. But it's got to be an intentional effort. We cannot just look at marbling in this breed. We've got to look at that's another thing we have to look at is the milk yield and stress that to help these cows be able to excel in our production system and the calves. The other key is the nutritional plane that calf is exposed to through feed, milk intake, and so forth is also critical in impacting the potential marbling score or quality grade of that calf later on down the road. So it's very critical that we help that cow as much as possible and to get the most out of that calf.
So, Dr. Horner, at what age do you recommend that people take the calf, wean the calf? What is the optimal age to start them on a very good? I mean, creep should be there from the time they're born, I think. And I do feed my mamas too. And I make sure my mamas get feed even in their third trimester. But, I'm overkill most of the time. But can you just tell everybody what you feel is optimal for calf production?
Yeah, Desi. Typically, I would say I actually try to stay away from being dead set on an age. But if I had to choose one, I would say most of the Wagyu calves are around 4 months of age. Most of our top producers will have them off that full blood female by about 4 months of age, but that will vary, no question. And one big factor is how well that calf is eating. That's the most critical criterion for determining when a calf should be weaned more than anything else. And if that calf is eating, say, 2 pounds of starter or creep feed consistently, and the rumen function is starting to develop extremely well, that calf is basically getting ready to be weaned and ready. So the number one criterion is the amount of feed intake on that calf. That's the most critical thing. Calf's eating well. We've had producers both here in the States and Japan wean them as young as 2 months of age. Now that's pushing it, I will say, but it's simply because the calves were eating so well and were so healthy, never missed a beat, and they've done it and they continue to do it. Typically around 4 months of age, if they are on a recip, if they're on like like you talk about sometimes, if they're on a dairy cow for sure, or on an Angus type influenced animal or something with Simmental or something else in it, you can maybe go 5-6 months. Typically, I prefer to see them off of no longer than 6 months. But I will say that, and I've said this many times through the years, if you leave a full-blood Wagyu calf on a full-blood Wagyu mama longer than that 4 to 6 month window, you're not doing either one of them a favor, neither the calf nor the female. And they've got to be off. But the primary criterion is how well that calf is eating, and that's why you've got to, as you do, offer them that creep feed as early as possible after birth. And it's amazing how often I've seen them go up. Actually, I've seen the calf born in the morning, and by that afternoon, they were already up going and nibbling and smelling of the creep feed the first day.
Yeah.
And I find that hard to believe, but they're very curious anyway. And you expose them to that. But the other key is the earlier that they're exposed to the dry feed, the more they're eating that grain, the faster their rumen develops. We also, that's the other I'm going to say challenge in this breed, in my opinion, in addition to milk yield and maternal instinct in the females, is feed efficiency, conversion of nutrients to growth and to tissue. And so the earlier you can get them eating, the faster the rumen develops, and everything will be more accelerated all the way through their life as a result.
Yeah, I agree with that. And mine do eat. And let me tell you, those calves, you have to be careful about what's in your pastures too, because those little calves will pick up everything. They'll eat oak leaves. I've seen them pick up sticks. They're like kids, you know. They'll put anything. They're just put anything in their mouth, drink out of mud puddle. I just, I'm like, oh my God, what are we going to do with this calf?
Yeah, you're right. I wish I had the picture with me. One time I went out on some of ours, and I looked, and this calf. What has he got around his head? And he had one of the white plastic lawn chairs around his head, and walking around the pasture with that lawn chair on his head. And that was quite a
That's
sight. But
right.
yeah, their curiosity. You got to be careful with
That
them.
got to be careful. That's right. So, um, let our listeners know what. Okay, so we have our calves and we've got them on creep and they're doing really good. I have heard you talk before about stages of feeding our Wagyu cattle.
Yes. Yeah, we typically we recommend a high energy, high protein. And when people might say, well, I wonder what's a high energy, high protein creep. Well, it's not a 12 to 14% protein standard creep that you will find in most feed stores here in the United States that are intended for traditional or conventional beef cattle. One of the first things I learned as in my experience in Japan, well, the Wagyu have nutritional requirements much more comparable to dairy breeds and not the other beef breeds. They typically require more protein, more energy, oftentimes just more help. They also are a little more finicky. Oftentimes, they're not quite as aggressive as, say, an Angus calf. So that's going to be a highly palatable feed. So on our stages, typically we'll have that starter stage, that first preferably that first 0 to 4 months of age, where they're on that a minimum of 18% protein. We have some herds that have a heavy Tajima breeding in their Wagyu cattle. The strain that is, higher marbling, smaller frame, less
Right.
milk, less growthy, little less thrifty as calves, especially. They will feed as high as a 20 or 22% protein creep if their herd is heavy Tajima breeding. So typically, a creep feed will be uh, 18 to 22% protein, no more than 12% fiber in it. Those calves don't need that indigestible fiber at that stage. They need the protein and they need starch. Uh, so that's what we recommend, and highly palatable. Then we take them from there, transition them over to what we call a grower or developer feed. This is where we're really teaching them to eat. We're trying to grow frame. We're trying to to expand the rib and the body capacity of the calf during this time. We don't want to fatten them. That again requires a higher protein feed and higher energy than what we typically would feed a growing beef calf over here. And we typically will have herds drop from that 18 to 20% creep feed down to around the 16% or so, depending on the forage that they're feeding. If they're feeding alfalfa, you can feed a little lower protein in your grain. If you're feeding a grass or small grain forage, you may need the protein. But again, a very highly palatable feed. But there, we're just basically preparing them for either the breeding herd or the finishing phase. We want to grow them, put structure on them, not fatten them. That also is a stage that's very critical if you're producing replacement females. You don't want to overfeed them during this stage, as we have quite a bit of evidence through the years that if we overfeed these replacement females prior to puberty, we're going to put basically more fat cells in their udders and less milk secreting cells in their udders. The problem with that, we already have a breed that doesn't milk that great already. Then if we overfeed these heifers, replacement females, and we get them too fat, and we get fat deposited in that udder, we're going to limit their milk production even more than it's already limited genetically. So you got to be careful not to overcondition the replacement heifers. We typically will not feed them as much as we'll feed a meat prospect. But after they're weaned, we recommend that replacement females and developing bull calves be separated from all the meat prospects, and they're fed totally differently. The meat prospects will be fed more grain, obviously. Sometimes even again, they may even be fed through a self feeder, creep feeder during that time. Uh, Then the key is during that time there from weaning to the time they enter the breeding herd or finish phase, we want to grow them, not fatten them. Then at that point, then we will recommend our program typically is a 2-phase finisher phase. We'll have a temporary receiving ration oftentimes where they first enter the phase 1 finishing. But then from basically they will initially start around 9 to 10 months of age. That's our recommendation. That's where many of the Japanese will start the calves on finishing around 9 to 10 months of age, no less than 400 pounds ideally. We put them on the finishing phase, and the full bloods will be on that phase and that diet. Again, that will still be a higher protein diet than what you would feed an Angus calf, no question. Typically, instead of say a 11 or 12% protein, that phase 1 finisher in our program will be a 14 to 15% protein in total diet. Again, during that time, they will be on that anywhere maybe from 10 months to a year. Then we move them over to our phase 2, or what we call our pre-harvest phase, and move them onto a higher energy ration, lower protein, still higher protein again than what a commercial calf would get. That's also where we typically will restrict the vitamin A based on research from Dr. Flaherty and his group at Ohio State, based on research from Japan. We know by restricting vitamin A during that final phase and no later than 23 months of age, that we can accelerate marbling anywhere from 10 to 30% during that last phase. And they'll be on that phase typically 3 to 6 months, and then they'll be harvested. That's their traditional track that a meat animal will go through. On full bloods, what we typically recommend on age at harvest, the majority of our clients will be 24 to 28 months of age at harvest. I would say the overwhelming majority of them now would be in that window with the full bloods. We still do have a few hardliners, I call them, that will go up around the 30 months. Sometimes still in excess of that, but less and less. When I first started traveling to Japan, Desi, back in '94, it was not uncommon for me to see cattle over there be fed all the way to 36 months before they were harvested.
That's right. I saw that in Japan as well.
Very, very common. Now they're doing much the same as our producers over here. They're 24 to 30 months of age. Again, most of them 24 to 28. And I think three of the national carcass champions in Japan in the last 5 years have been 28 months of age or less. I think one of them was actually 25 months of age, and that got everybody's attention. So we know these cattle do not have to be fed out as long, but in order to do that, they've got to be started off right. And everything's got to be, every I needs to be dotted and T crossed all the way through to be able to achieve that. If it's taking you longer to feed your cattle out, you've either not done something you should have done early on in their life, or you've maybe got too caught up in inbreeding. And that's one thing we have seen in the Wagyu cattle, in my experience with the inbreeding, is a significantly reduced performance and even greater impaired feed efficiency. So it will take longer. But most of the producers and our recommendations, 24 to 28 months on a full blood, 20 to 24 months on an F1 Angus cross. Now, if you cross that Wagyu with a dairy animal, say a Holstein or Jersey, you're going to need to be prepared to feed them out just like a full blood. They will take longer as well. They will not feed out as quickly as an Angus Wagyu cross. So.
Right. But I will say, Dr. Horner, that during COVID, people were stuck sometimes keeping their cattle longer than they wanted to. And when I would grade them, I would say I saw higher marbling scores on carcasses for people that did keep their animals longer. I mean, have you seen that?
Yeah, that's the thing. They never stop marbling. This breed's amazing when it comes to that. They never stop marbling. The only thing you see is that at a certain time out there, typically from my experience and what I've been told by the Japanese, typically on most full bloods around 32 months of age, the problem you see is they continue to marble. However, the rate of that marbling is superseded by the rate of sub-Q fat deposition, external fat,
Okay.
and internal body fat around the organs. So they will continue to marble, but it becomes it becomes very inefficient because they're actually putting on subcutaneous fat and kidney, heart, and pelvic fat at a higher rate than they are the marbling. The other thing you run into is that animal's immune system begins suffering when you get all that fat accumulating around their internal organs. Also, again, they will fall off on efficiency. They'll fall off on feed intake. And it's just risky to take them out that long. But Desi, I'm with you. We had some herds. We had a herd in South America, in Chile, that we worked with, Moyendo Wagyu, that relied primarily on exports of their Wagyu beef to Europe. And during that time, exports were closed off for about 6 months. So we had to go to a holding pattern to try to hold those cattle, not allow them to lose weight. If they lose weight, they'll lose marbling. We had to at least have them maintain.
Right.
And but they also saw higher marbling scores during that time. So no, you're right. They will continue marbling. The other thing that we have seen through the years is there's a pretty good correlation with days on feed and age at harvest with fineness of the marbling as well.
Yes.
I think that's one thing people tend to forget about, that we want the marbling, but typically chefs really like that really fine, small marbling as well, texture is concerned. And in our experience, there is a genetic component of that too, no question. But in our experience too, the longer you leave them on feed, you will have not just more marbling, but it will be of a finer texture as those fat cells begin differentiating. They begin basically breaking apart there later on in the feeding period. So there are benefits to it, but you just have to keep in mind there's also tremendous risk the longer you leave that calf on feed. Also, they become less efficient, and there's an economic component. So many of our clients try to get as much marbling as they can and get it as fine as they can, but get it done between that 24 to 28 months of age. And we have a number of them that are doing that.
Well, the Triple Crown, we have when you send in your ribeye, part of the questioning is what you fed, what the animal weighed, the hot carcass weight, and the age at harvest. And we've got a lot of we're doing right now, taking all of that data and doing like you said, which I found it very interesting, doing a fineness of marbling based on the age of harvest and the feed composition. And I think it's going to be really interesting when we get that information out.
Yeah, Desi, and you've been so instrumental and so committed to generating, collecting that data, and I feel like our industry's indebted to you, and will be for years to come. We appreciate that.
Well,
and how you basically initiated that and you carried it through.
Well, raising these cattle affects my pocketbook too. So we need all the information we can on how to streamline this and educate ourselves, because knowledge is power when it comes to raising cattle. And it's very, it's not cheap to raise cattle, and we have to make sure not only that we raise them, but that we also get, our money back in the production of the Wagyu. And so what you're doing, your feed is just amazing. What you know about how to feed them, and I'm so glad that you're telling everybody listening, because they're going to take this home today and make some adjustments in their programs. I know I am. I'm really bad about keeping them too late and probably overfeeding my females. I'm going to reevaluate my program today after hearing about the females.
That's awesome, Desi. I'm sure you're doing a good job. We can always fine tune and do better. But I do want to say one thing, if you allow me, indulge me for a minute, is that there have been numerous folks that have been instrumental in teaching me. Like I say, this is a 30-year journey. And I grew up on a dairy farm here in Texas. I was invited to go to Japan, primarily to work with dairy cattle, help dairy producers. Found out very quickly most of the dairymen also are Wagyu producers, and I thought it was all a very patriotic endeavor on their part. When every dairy I went to, I'd see Wagyu, and boy, this is their national breed, and everybody's really patriotic and wants to have their Wagyu breed. And then several years later, I found out they all get a nice little property tax break. So they're all about the money too, just like we are over there. But I did learn that. That's how many of them have. But one of the first ones, I just want to mention this. My primary mentor in Japan was a fellow named Yoshihisa Nakamura in Miyazaki Prefecture. And Mr. Nakamura was the first one that actually gave me an opportunity to actually formulate his diets for his Wagyu cattle. And he was one of those that just constantly thinking out of the box. I believe he was a fourth generation Wagyu producer. And I'll never forget the day he asked me, he said, Jimmy, can you also help me with my Wagyu cattle? And I said, Mr. Nakamura, I'd be glad to, but I don't know a dang thing about them. and he started chuckling. I think he appreciated my honesty. He says, well, that's okay. You know everything about the inside. I will teach you about the outside. And so we kind of had a deal there. And he mentored me up until his death a few years ago. He died of pancreatic cancer very, very quickly and just devastated me. But he was my primary mentor, gave me that first opportunity. From the time he first asked me to help him with his Wagyu cattle, I think I traveled over there to his place and his neighbors and friends and other places probably 10 to 12 times during that 3.5 year period. But from the time he asked me, it was about 3 years before I delivered his first set of rations to him for his Wagyu cattle, because I was so ignorant of the breed. I'll just say it. I didn't know anything about them. Two, I wanted to treat them with utmost respect and learn as much as I could about them. I knew they were different from our Angus breeds and other breeds here, and I wanted to respect that. And so that's how it initially started. And then also Mr. Tadashi Sawamoto up in Obihiro, Hokkaido, the Northern Island. He was a dairy and a Wagyu producer, and he was very instrumental. He actually approached me after one of the seminars early on about some of our all-natural products that we had. The Japanese have been producing all-natural beef forever. And it's been, kind of a, last 10, 20 year thing for us here in the States. They've been all-natural forever. And so he was interested in that. So we started exporting through him, his company, Protocol Japan. I ended up licensing him to use the name. We had a large a group of folks, a very, very good team that helped us. And then I think we had 20 some odd of the Japanese come over and visit our manufacturing plant that we built in 2001. That was quite an experience, having 20 so Japanese guests here, but we loved it. But Mr. Nakamura, Mr. Sawamoto, Mr. Kawaki down in Kyushu, Tanegashima, Nobu Murakami in Kobe. I could go on and on. Kim Akiyama. Kim Akiyama from the States was my translator for many, many years. She totally spoiled me. That's why I don't speak good Japanese to this day, because I was so spoiled by Kim's prolific ability to translate, and she was wonderful on the farm. So that was kind of, and when we worked in Japan for about 18 years, helping them, establishing relationships. And then in the fall of 2012, at the Wagyu Olympics in Sasebo, Japan, who walks by the Protocol Japan booth that I was sitting in with one of my clients, but Mr. Bob Estrin from Lone Mountain Ranch in New Mexico, and Grant Robinson at the time was managing Cane Ridge cattle in Paris, Kentucky, and at the time the executive director of AWA, David Beatty. And they walked by. They did a double take, because I don't look like your typical Japanese. And they came back by, and then we struck up a conversation. They got to meet one of my clients there that was visiting there in the booth, and we got back home. And I believe Grant Robinson was my first client in the U.S. Bob Estrin was my second, and then they're still customers and close friends to this day. And it's just, and my wife also happened to be with me. My wife, Teresa, she passed away a couple of years ago, but she loved traveling. So she was with me that year in 2012 when we met those folks. And basically my life has never been the same. They realized, I found out that I'd been working with the Japanese for 18 years at that time, pretty much in obscurity. And then when I got home, Bob and Grant were ringing my phone off the wall. And that's when we started working with the producers here in the U.S. And now we're very fortunate to work with about 300 producers total here in the U.S. and Japan and a few other countries. But that's. I just wanted to just mention that, preface to everything else, is that there were numerous individuals that were very much key influencers on me, taught me, brought me along. Even here in the States with Bob Estrin, Grant Robinson, Sheila Patink, and many others, I've learned so much. And their passion. I mean, there's folks here in the States whose passion actually match some of the top producers we work with in Japan. And I love it because I can tend to be very passionate, maybe sometimes too much so. But that's kind of how, to preface all the nutrition aspects, we can continue talking about it. I just wanted to share that's kind of how things evolved with me and the Japanese. But there have been numerous individuals that have mentored me, taught me, and I continue to learn every day. In many cases, too, I will tell you, much of my learning also has been from the herdsmen, or the people that actually spend time with the cattle, not necessarily the owners. The owners have taught me a lot, managers, but the folks that do the day in, day out grind with those calves, with those cows, I never, ever take lightly as far as their input, their insight. And I continue to learn from them to this day. And I typically, when I would go visit a farmer ranch, much of my time while I'm there, I'll be spending with those folks that are involved with the daily activities, because I feel it's just so key, because they're the ones, those folks that are taking care of those cattle day in, day out, feeding them, doctoring them, so forth. That's where it all is. That's where it all is. And the thing is, if they do not buy in, if they do not understand, if they're confused, I'm pretty much useless. My effectiveness is completely limited and completely dependent on those people taking care of those cattle day in, day out. So I have a lot of respect for them, and I rely on them heavily.
Yes, and I want to go back a little bit to what you said. Where was it? Was you worked with? I know that where you worked, they produce better cattle actually, and it's been recorded and there's data on it than Kobe. But the Kobe has gotten all of the kudos, so to speak, because of their advertising. But I want people to know that there are other perfectures that produce cattle that are exceptional. And I believe there's, is it Mississauga, where they produce nothing but female cattle because the females have higher marbling than the males. Is that correct?
I'm not sure which prefecture it is, but I will tell you there are a lot of females fed out in Japan. We've got an individual that's in the Tottori prefecture that feeds out about 1,700 head per year, and they're all females.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of females fed out in the Miyazaki prefecture as well. But all
Miyazaki.
Over Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And Desi, same as here. Same as here. In the our facility we have here at Protocol Farms, our Wagyu Feeding and Research Center, we have almost 1,000 head in one barn right now today, and I would say probably almost half of those are females. The data I've seen through the years, both in Japan and here, it's not uncommon for a heifer to have somewhere between a 2 to 5% higher IMF score on average than a steer. So yes, and some of the highest, some of the BMS 12 cattle we've seen out of our facility here, many of the BMS 12 cattle I've seen in Japan will have been heifers as well. So they typically do marble higher, and many folks in Japan feel like they are actually more economical to feed than the steers.
Because they gain weight faster. Also,
the heifers don't gain weight faster necessarily, but they don't have that thing we call testosterone in them. And so they deposit more fat intramuscularly and everywhere else It may actually take them, a month or two longer to feed out, but they do deposit the intramuscular fat at a higher rate and degree than the steers. So it's not uncommon, like I say, here and in Japan, some of the highest grading individuals that we have seen through the years have been females, no question,
Mm-hmm.
on the Wagyu.
And
And
I have seen in the Triple Crown Steak Challenge, we've had grand champion steaks from your feeding protocol, and we've had fineness of marbling, and I checked, and it was from your feeding protocol. So I know that it works. I know that you know what you're talking about. And so I hope everybody takes what you say to heart, because we've seen it in the Triple Crown. And I also want to bring up, I know that here in the South, we just can't get, we can't get alfalfa, at a reasonable price like they can out west. So I guess you know the differences in the regions as to what they can enhance their herds with feed wise by region.
yeah, Daisy, that's a very good point. And the the key is knowing what you have as a producer, knowing what you have to feed. So most producers, obviously, the forage component is going to be their primary component in their feeding program. So you've got to have it tested. I harp on that all the time. We got to have it. The forage has to be tested. We have to have a nutritional profile from a reputable laboratory. And once I have that, it really doesn't matter what the quality is. I mean, we prefer average to good quality, but even if you have lower quality, we can work with that as long as we know what we have. And so all that means is, excuse me, all that means is that if you've got a lower quality forage, we've just got to supplement more. We've got to fortify those rations more so than if you have a higher quality forage. The and a note I'll mention on the alfalfa. Alfalfa is a very good feed, and especially through the younger stages of the calves. Cows do great on alfalfa. It minimizes your supplementation and supplementation cost. But oftentimes, like you say, we can't get it, or it's just completely cost prohibitive, and that's okay. We'll work with grass hay, small grain hay. My goodness, I've seen it all. Straw. The Japanese feed a lot of rice straw. We don't feed all that here. And there's only really one thing in rice straw, and that is fiber. Not much of anything else. But we work with that. We just have to supplement accordingly based on what we have, and you can do fine. And then actually, as a cattle on the finishing programs, you don't even have to have the real high quality forage. I still like a decent quality as far as digestibility and intake potential. The lower quality you have, the less you're going to be able to eat of the total ration. But we can deal with all those. The key is that we have to know what we have, and we can balance the ration accordingly for anyone. We just know what's in that forage, and that's where everything starts and ends. And that also is the one component of the ration that you maximize. Is typically the least expensive part of the feeding program. So we need to know what's in that. Then we build everything. So typically, all of our clients, 300 or so of them, the rations may all be totally different. We try to individualize our formulations based on the forage that customer is feeding, and then we will maintain that. And if the forage changes, they get a new cutting, it's new hay season, get a new load, whatever, we'll make adjustments as necessary, or as often as we need to. But the key is knowing what you have, then delivering a properly balanced profile of nutrients into those cattle day in, day out, and being consistent also on how you feed them and how you manage them day in, day out.
I have a question for you, Dr. Horner. I've read a lot of different things, but does it matter that you feed them at the same time, that you keep a very consistent schedule, or is that important in the digestion, in the rumen
Yes.
of the cattle?
Is he? No doubt. No doubt. No question. You've got to be consistent in how you feed them. Otherwise, you're going to actually cause digestive upsets. You're going to cause issues like bloat off feed. Also, you want to try to maintain a steady state environment in that animal's digestive system. So the more consistent you can be with and I will tell you, we've got folks in the U.S. here that are very consistent. But I'll tell you, that's one thing I learned in Japan very quickly. Those folks are committed to consistency. I mean, almost to the nth degree. And I learned that was one of the reasons is you're going to have a healthier animal. The more you can repeat your practices, your management practices, your feeding, the same time every day, basically you're going to have a healthier animal to work with. And a healthier animal is going to be a more productive animal. They're going to be more efficient. They're going to digest their feed more efficiently. They're going to grow better. They're going to produce a higher quality carcass. Another healthy animal is never going to meet their genetic potential. And I always maintain that the Wagyu breed is not more vulnerable to stress than any other breed. But I will, no question, maintain that the Wagyu breed has more to lose when they are stressed than any other breed. So the more we can do to minimize their stress, the more consistent we can be in our approach to those cattle every day, including the feeding, monitoring, so forth, treating, weighing, whatever it may be, the less stress those cattle are going to incur. And that's vital in this breed. We have a breed that has such tremendous potential to give their owners a high return on investment. The key is we have to provide that animal with an environment to be able to reach that potential. And that's always my primary focus. I'll say my entire team through the years, our primary focus is to keep these cattle healthy. That what's funny, that was the biggest obstacle I encountered working with the Japanese, is they just could not accept the fact that some gray-headed, ugly old American would be as committed to the health of their prized Wagyu cattle as they were. And so I learned really quick I had to earn that confidence and that respect, that I was just as committed as they were to keeping those cattle healthy. And a healthy animal is always going to perform better. So the more you can do on your end to low stress handling, consistent, very consistent in your approach, minimizing the stress that they may be exposed to, as far as the climate's concerned, all that, the more you're going to get in the end, and the happier you're going to be, and the happier that animal's going to be in the end. But it's very critical that we have a consistent and a very intentional approach to how we manage these cattle.
Well, I certainly agree with the stress, and I can do it because I'm a small producer, but all my cattle can get under, cover if there's inclement weather or, really cold wind. And let me tell you, whenever we have a storm coming, you can look out over my pastures and it looks like I don't own a single cow because they're all they're all already in there. They know what's coming. They're already in that barn, and
and Daisy, that's important too. You don't have to build a Taj Mahal or some kind of castle or mansion for them either. You just have some type of shelter structures, whatever, to help them get out of that time of year where they're exposed to the harshest elements. Some way to protect them. A Wagyu can tolerate cold extremely well if you keep them dry. All right.
Mm-hmm.
They can also tolerate heat extremely well if you keep them shaded and have a little bit of air movement. It's amazing. This breed is so durable. I've been asked that before. How's this breed? This breed can adapt so well to different environments. How's that possible versus many other breeds? Well, if you look at Japan, from north to south, you've got 3 islands that are basically the size of California in total if you connected them together. But the thing is, in the south, down in Kyushu, like little Tanegashima Island, where one of our folks, Mr. Kawaki, is, he's south of Kyushu. It gets very, very humid and hot down in that part of Japan. Extremely humid, much like, well, probably more like your area, Alabama, Georgia, Florida. But then you go up and you go through Honshu, where Tokyo is, and you go up in Hokkaido, the northern island, the biggest island, and their environment may be more like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and you've got those
It is
Wagyu
like
cattle.
Minnesota.
Yeah, yeah. And so those cattle are being trafficked and transferred and moved constantly, being bought and raised and sold through those different climates. So you've got an animal that's had to adapt to drastically different climates within that one country. So to me, I think that's one reason it lends itself to them. Once we have them over here in Australia and other places, why they do so well is they have to be that way over there because the climate is so diverse from north to south. They're in Japan, and they actually, so they can do well under any of those. But we do have to help them at times, and I'm always maintaining that if that animal is stressed, you're losing money as a producer. And anytime that animal is stressed, if that animal is stressed, they're typically going to be losing marbling. That intramuscular fat typically is the first fuel for them to try to stay comfort and maintain that thermal neutral zone or that comfort zone. It's going to be the first energy that's used in the majority of the time. So if you want to preserve marbling, if you want to preserve your investment,
Yes.
you need to try to minimize stress at all times because they can go backwards so quickly. We did a study several years ago in Iowa with some F1s. And when they were exposed to blizzard-like conditions without any shelter, they lost 12% of their marbling in 2 weeks before they were harvested. Just in 2 weeks' time, in blizzard-like conditions at a feedlot in Iowa, F1 Wagyu cattle lost 12% of their marbling. So it can go, like I say, very quickly if we're not committed to trying to help keep them as comfortable as possible all the time.
And I've been stressing that in every podcast about the care. You know, you're going to get back what you put into it, and you've invested so much. You need to go that extra mile and make sure that your cattle are not stressed, because why would you want to? That 12% of marbling is a lot of money in feed cost. It really is.
Yes, ma'am. And the bad thing is, that was the last 2 weeks prior to them being harvested. You never could get it back. They're stressed earlier in life. They may rebound and get some of it back, but the problem is you'll never. If an animal is stressed, you're never going to attain their full genetic potential. You can't. It's not practical to think that we can keep them 100% free of stress. But I feel like our job in providing proper husbandry to these cattle is to try to minimize that stress as much as possible. Maybe we can't mitigate it 100%, but the more we can minimize it, and that's not just a Wagyu, that's any cattle. I grew up on a dairy, same thing. Any cattle you have, I think you have an obligation to try to minimize stress with those cattle. It's just that when the Wagyu cattle are stressed, they're losing more than any other breed I have ever worked with when they're stressed. And owners have got to be cognizant of that, and the fact that when they're stressed, the more they're stressed, you're never allowing them to reach that genetic potential. And that's why we ended up, putting our facility in here at Protocol Farms. Bottom line, it's all centered around cattle comfort. We just want to try to help our producers attain the genetic potential as much as possible in those cattle by providing as stress-free of an environment as possible, even though it's not 100% stress-free. But they're at least in that facility, basically to try to maximize performance, health, and in the end, carcass quality by protecting them from as much stress as possible. And that's one reason. That's one of the main reasons we did this several years ago. Is we had several clients that had been asking me for years, instead of just developing their feeding programs and monitoring those programs for them. Could we also put a facility in to help take care of these cattle to get as high quality as possible back? And there are a lot of folks around the country that do a good job feeding cattle. There are not a lot of folks around the country do a good job of feeding Wagyu cattle. But there's more to it. There's more involved. There's more capital involved. There's more management involved, no question. But if you can do that, and justify that, it sure is worth it. And there's nothing makes me happier than to get a picture from a customer just with an awesome picture as far as the beef quality, and or a customer calls me or says, Jimmy, that was the best harvest we've ever had in 25 years. We've never had a harvest like that. That's what keeps me going. It's not necessarily the money or other things, but when our customers are happy and we see those results, boy, that just like that juices me up like nothing else, and makes it all worthwhile.
And I would like to say too, when you take great care of your cattle and you go to sell them, and people consistently know that you have really not, like most of mine are, they weigh really good. They're overfed probably, but I don't have a problem selling, weanlings and things like that. People know, and I have repeat customers. And I think when you have a great product and people know that you have a great product, there's no problem moving that product in the US at all. Do you agree with that, Dr. Horner?
Totally agree. It's key, Desi, no question. And you build that reputation too. You take care of your cattle. They're good cattle. They're sound. They're healthy.
Mm-hmm.
They know what they're getting. And then something I harp on all the time too is if you're raising animals for meat, be more committed to the data. Try to collect as much data in the interim time. Take care of them and collect as much data as you can. That data is what helps us make good decisions in the future. It's hard to make an informed decision if you don't have something to manage that animal with, as far as records or data. And we're seeing over time. I think we're seeing more and more of a commitment here in the States on. You've had it from the very beginning. You've encouraged it. You've instigated it. You've been awesome. You've been committed to it on folks collecting more and more data on their cattle over here, so we can make better decisions. And I think we're seeing it out in the cattle being merchandised. If you want to get top dollar for your cattle, make sure they're healthy, sound, well taken care of, and that you've got some data to back them up, and you're not just selling them off based off myth and folklore. That's been done too long in this industry. It needs
Right.
to come to an end. And I
It
appreciate the role
does.
you've played in that. And I think that we've got a wonderful breed. We're a small breed compared to many, but boy, there's nothing else like Wagyu. And we've had folks from here and there, far away, to say, Jimmy, that's the best steak. I've never tasted anything like that ever. And we've got a wonderful product. But if you want to separate yourself from the pack, take care of your cattle and collect as much data as you can. And then even if we go through cyclic times where maybe prices are down or what this and that, if you've got a good product and you've got data to back that product up, even if prices are down, you're still always going to get the best price. You're still going to sell your
Right.
animals. And
Right.
we do that quite a bit, and we're seeing more and more folks, and it thrills my heart to see that here in the States, more and more folks are becoming more and more committed to not just taking care of their cattle properly, which is key, but also more committed to collecting data and in marketing their cattle backed by data. And that is very refreshing to
Yes.
see.
And I have one more. I have a question I should have asked when we were talking about nutrition, but I really would like to know this because I struggle with it in what I do. And I want to ask you, what percentage of fat should be in the feed? Because I've seen everything from 3% to 10%. And, I just really would like to finally get that out in the open about the fat content of feed.
Okay, Desi, yeah, good question. Well, one, that's going to be dictated by how much starch is in the feed. Okay, or energy. The majority of the energy needs to come from starch. That's your glucose precursor. That's what's going to fuel your marbling. All right, in these Wagyu cattle. So the higher starch you have in a feed, the less fat you can have in it. If you do start putting fat in a feed, you're going to increase the energy, but it's not going to be glucose energy. It's not going to necessarily fuel marbling. Now it may help maintain body condition. It may help accelerate growth, gain. And then obviously it may help increase the amount of fatty acids that are deposited in that tissue. But typically we will, I would say most of the diets we formulate for the finishing cattle will be anywhere from 3 to 5% fat. I would say we typically will never formulate over 5 to 6% fat in the diet, primarily because the rumen bacteria cannot handle free fat in the diet. I've always likened fat in a ration when it comes to that rumen, and oftentimes, I'm talking to guys on these ranches, not necessarily the wives, but I said it's almost like if you feed too much of that free fat in the diet, it's like your wife putting a chain on the refrigerator. You cannot get into that refrigerator and get to any food. If you have too much free fat, Desi, in that rumen, it coats your fiber particles. It'll coat your feedstuffs in that rumen, and the bacteria cannot penetrate it and get to it. So the fat can increase caloric density of the ration. Again, it can help with fatty acid profile, bump them up some in the end in the meat. But if you get too carried away with it, and in my opinion, somewhere if it's all from free fat, and I'm talking like fat from vegetable oils, tallow, any endogenous fat like in distillers grain, corn gluten, this and that, hominy. You've got to limit that to between 5 to 6% of the diet, or you will start coating fiber particles in the rumen. You'll start depressing digestion. You'll start depressing intake, and you'll start depressing performance. You'll also see them become loose. The manure will become loose, just like they're acidotic from too much starch. The only way you can go beyond the 5 or 6% total fat in the diet, if you want to try to do that, is by bringing what we call a rumen protected fat in, a rumen inert, a rumen bypass fat. There are a number of those on the market, and they can be fed. They are very expensive. They're more expensive, obviously. But if they comprise part of that fat, you can go up to that 7-8%. If the ration is comprised of a rumen protected fat. If it's not rumen protected, you need to limit it to 5 to 6% fat. Otherwise, you're not going to be happy with the results you're getting. So a little bit of fat's good, and not a problem with it in the ration. But if you go overboard with it, especially with what we call free fat and not rumen protected fat, you will disrupt your rumen function, and you'll pay the price. Your animals pay the price by doing too much. So shoot for somewhere between 3 to 5 to 6% and no more. And if you say, well, Horner, I want more than that. And I mean, I love feeding fat, this and that, or I want to try it. That's fine. But you're going to have to use a more expensive rumen bypass fat to do that. I will say along those lines, I'll let you know, we're getting ready to start a study here after the first of the year here at our facility with one of those rumen bypass fats. And it's primarily comprised of palmitic acid and oleic acid, but it's in a protected form. About 85% of that fat is inert in the rumen, means that it will go all the way through the rumen. It will not disrupt the fiber digestion in that rumen and bacterial growth, and it'll be delivered straight to the small intestine where it'll eventually be absorbed and utilized. But we want to look and see if we come in a ration. So that ration, Desi, may be a 6, 7, 8% fat from just that bypass fat. But we want to see how much we can impact the fatty acids in the meat from something like that. And if we can get a bump in the oleic acid, particularly, this product we're going to look at is almost half oleic acid, but in a protected form.
Right.
So we're going to see if we can bump that oleic acid up. Since oleic acid has been the one fatty acid that the Japanese have equated or correlated to the highest degree with overall health of the meat, and that overall umami or wow experience of the meat. The oleic acid, if you're going to single one component out in that meat, the oleic acid is that one single component that has a highest correlation over any others. So we're going to see, we already have a product that already has a tremendous wow factor, but can we make it even higher? Can we get even more of a wow factor if we can bring some of these rumen bypass fats in? And then if that's the case, is there a way we can benefit from it economically? And can we justify it economically? We don't know that yet, but I think there may be some potential there, and we're going to look at it. So we feel like we may see a bump in marbling, but we definitely are going to be looking at and hoping we can get a bump in the fatty acid profile and particularly the oleic acid. So back to your original question, fat's a good thing. Too much of it's not a good thing, depending on the source of the fat, but it definitely has a place. The key is you want to maximize the energy from the starch in that feed, just because from a sheer cost standpoint, that starch energy is going to be less expensive than the energy from the fat. The starch also, as I mentioned earlier, is going to fuel the marbling more than the fat because of the glucose aspect. The glucose is completely required to fuel marbling in that animal. So, so yes, a little fat's fine, but just be careful when you feed too much. And if you are feeding a high level, you need to be really cognizant of the sources that those levels are coming from. So because again, the fat can really disrupt your rumen function if you overdo it.
Well, I'm glad you told me that. I have seen tubs on the market that I know people use in the winter to supplement along with their feed programs and their forage and their dry forage. And some of them are 10% fat. And I just thought, well, let me ask Dr. Horner about that. You know, you see 3, 5, 6, 10, and it's supposed to, bring them through in a really cold climate, help them with their energy. And so I just wanted to ask you that to see how efficient those tubs might be.
Yeah, no, it can, and like I said, it depends on what else they're eating, but you just got to really be careful when you get up to those really high fat
Mm-hmm.
levels, and most of those are going to come from free fat, some kind of oil that they're putting in,
Yes.
or it's going to be coming from, like, say, a high fat distiller's grain or something that's going in that tub. You got to be careful
Right.
with it, because you can basically knock your cattle off feed, just like if you were feeding too much starch and inducing acidosis. You can be impairing performance if you feed too much free fat. There's a limit to how much free fat we can feed an animal in a day's time, and you just got to be
And
careful with those.
you did bring up something else. Well, I'm glad you brought it up because I want people to know this. Years ago, we had a breeder that kept sending in steaks for testing, and the steaks were beautiful. I mean, high marbling, beautiful ribeye size, very nice steaks. But when we did the flavor profile on them, put them through a professional taste panel, they had an off flavor. And I called them and I said, what are you feeding your cattle? Oh, I got this great thing, it was expensive. And it helps with fat. They had a good fatty acid profile, but the flavor was really not desirable. And we researched what they were feeding, and we found out they were feeding a product that had guaranteed more omega threes and sixes, and to help the fatty acid profile, but they used catfish oil in the feed, and the fish oil gave the meat a very odd flavor. And so I just want people to be concerned with what they're promising you. It may raise the fatty acid profile, but it may not be in a positive way. So
You may not want
we
to eat it.
found that
Yeah,
out
Lindsay,
the
that's a
hard
great
way.
point.
Yeah, you may not.
That's a great point. And that's why I say, you need to
Bec-
know what source that fat's coming from. That's another good
right,
reason right
right.
there. That's another good point too. We can talk about all this marbling and fatty acid and this and that, and Horner can get on his soapbox and talk about all this and that and stress and this and that. But in the end, what we're all working towards is that a final product that tastes wonderfully and that tastes like nothing else on the face of the earth, and just like knocks folks out of their chairs when they taste it. I remember my son-in-law Matt, the first time I made Wagyu for him, and I'll never forget this. And it was some full blood Wagyu, and I said, here you go, Matt, try this, and he goes, whoa, that is the best thing I've ever put in my mouth by far. And that's what we all have to keep in mind, is all this stuff is great, but in the end, how does that product taste? What's the flavor? Does it have that wow factor? Does it make people want more? And that's what we have to offer in the end. But that's what we have to continually be focused on, is the taste aspect of that beef on that plate in the end, more than anything else.
That's right. And what you feed does affect your flavor profile. And
No question.
that's very important.
No, no question, it does, and that's something we've dealt with for years. You're feeding some type of in-silage forage, silage, haylage. Sometimes you have to be careful if you feed moldy hay, if you're
Oh,
feeding fat from animal sources. Oh my goodness, I could go on and on. We've dealt with this for years. Sometimes on your pasture, they may be picking something up from the pasture as well that gives it an off flavor before they're brought in. That may that five. Some folks will actually leave their cattle on pasture sometimes during the earlier phases of finishing, and then bring them in. Well, if you bring them in, you better have them on feed probably 90 days plus minimum coming off that pasture. You can also cause off flavor from that. So there's a huge variety of things that can cause off flavor of the beef. We just got to be cognizant of them. I'm typically very conservative, particularly on that last phase of finishing, what we call our phase 2 or pre-harvest phase. During the last 36 months, I am very, very, very particular and conservative with what we put in those rations. Everything has to be extremely high quality, and nothing that's where we can focus on cost, this and that, and cost is always a component. But the thing is, you got to be careful feeding something just based on cost during that latter phase of finishing, because that's where you can really impact the flavor of your beef, and in addition to the marbling, the shelf life, the color, all that. And we focus on all that. The Japanese have been getting premiums on color of their beef for many years, not just the how it grades out. So we also try to make sure we have help our customers with attain an end product that also has a good eye appeals to the consumer, has that bright cherry red, has that bright white fat. You can also impact the color tremendously, in addition to the flavor if you're not careful as well. And then I think we've talked about before too. Now too starting several years ago, I learned of the Go 55 program in Japan. Where they're also getting benefit or getting additional premiums for the fatty acid content, specifically oleic acid. If their carcass reaches 55% oleic acid or above, they get additional premiums because of how the Japanese have equated that to health benefits
yes.
primarily.
The
So
health benefits.
yes, so we just got to we've got to be very intentional and cognizant of what we're feeding that animal at all times, particularly that latter part of finishing, because that's where you can make or break that end product. And you may have a beautiful, and I've seen some, you may have a beautifully marbled, just like you talked about, a beautifully marbled piece of meat, like wow, but then it tastes like what. We cannot do that, cannot do it. And there's nothing more frustrating to me. So you've got to be very careful on what you feed them. No question. That we feel like that's our job. And sometimes I have to battle. Sometimes I'll have to battle producers. They say, "Well, Warner, I got to feed more of that. That's the cheapest thing I got." I said, "That's fine. We'll feed that somewhere else, but you're not feeding it here, okay? Because
Mm-hmm.
it may be we can't take the risk of feeding it here because of how it may impact that meat flavor or quality." So there are times that you just have to be very conservative and very cognizant of what you're putting in that animal, because garbage in, garbage out. And not to pinpoint any one thing, but that's if you're feeding silage. We have a lot of folks that feed silage, both here and in Japan. It's not that you can't feed it, but you've got to make sure that silage is good quality. You've got to make sure it's packed well. You've got to feed it out right, properly, manage it as you're feeding it, and otherwise you can affect the quality of that beef tremendously just from feeding a fermented product that may not be just right as well. So we have herds that feed a lot of in-silage forages or silages and work with them, but the quality is very critical. But also, I will tell you that we typically are more conservative with them there toward the end, just because of the potential impact they can have on the flavor of the beef.
Right.
Not just them. You can different oils and so forth too, but oftentimes silage can be the culprit if it's not really good quality, or if you have a bunker or a pit full of silage. and you're getting toward the end, you're just a month or two away from putting up new forage, and you get toward the end. In the 38 years I've been working as a nutritionist, 90% of my problems with silage being fed is always at the end of the year before the new crop comes in. We're back to that very, very back portion of the pit if it's in a bunker silo, and it can get pretty nasty, moldy. You can get quite a variety of mycotoxins in it, and you got to be really careful with that as well. So you just got to have quality ingredients coming in the animal's mouth all the time, or you can definitely affect not just the quality but the flavor of that beef in the end.
Right. I agree. Well, Dr. Horner, I have really enjoyed having you on this podcast, and I know the listeners are just really thinking about everything you've been saying. Me too. I've got to go back. I'm ready to go read all my labels and see what I'm doing, and also you sell product and you have developed products. So if any of you want to call Dr. Horner and talk to him about what he has, I'm sure he'd be available to help you get started in the right way.
Desi, I appreciate that. Well, I'll be glad to help you however I can.
Yeah.
My staff and I, we love what we do. My daughter, my son-in-law, I couldn't do this without them. My wonderful family, my son, daughter-in-law, my 7 precious grandkids, they keep me going. Our employees, I tell you, we all love what we do. We have a passion for what we do. We'll help folks however we can. We do have our own manufacturing facility that we built back in 2001, and we can, but also we work with a lot of other feed companies in different areas here and in Japan. We'll send menus to them, formulations to them. But yes, we do have that and a line of different feeds, minerals, supplements, all natural animal health products. And then we've got our feeding operation here. We're getting ready to open our second barn up, by the way, here. My son-in-law told me 2 weeks from yesterday. So 2 weeks from now, we're opening our second barn. So we'll have about 2,000 head of Wagyu here, primarily full bloods, here probably within the next 2 months. And then we'll have to decide when we're going to build our next one.
Oh my goodness. Well, we'll have to get some video and bring it to the public.
Sounds good, Desi. Hey, Desi, again,
That'd
thank
be
you
great.
for what you do. Thank you so much for what you do and your commitment to this industry. We're indebted to you. Love working with you. And any way we can help you too in your commitment to what you're doing. You let me know. We're in.
Send me the samples. That's all I need. And I also would like to call out, I'm doing some research on the different the composition of red Wagyu and black Wagyu beef. So that's in our, we're doing that too. And our fatty acids, that's our main program, is we're doing fatty acids now.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, we're feeding out quite a few reds too here at our facility. That's very
Oh, great. Okay, good. Because I have to know, when I go to a packing house, it has to be just reds, and I have to know that they're, reds, and
interesting.
And we're
you just
doing
keep
that.
doing what you're doing. You keep doing what you're doing, and you let us know however we can help you.
Okay, I'll be bugging you to death.
Let's do it.
All right, sounds great. Well, thank you, Dr. Horner, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time on Herd Nerds. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.